With World War II and all of its horrors finally behind the world at large, citizens thought they would be entering significant peacetime. They were sorely mistaken. The physical fighting that ended in 1945 simply changed battlefields into a spy war. Once the United States had brought the world into the nuclear bomb era, the Soviet Union, among other countries, began the race to space and the race to build the largest atomic bomb in the history of mankind. While they failed in the official space race, they succeeded when it came to the creation of nuclear warheads. They often detonated their creations and to this day have the record of blowing up the largest bomb ever made, Tsar Bomba. Between this new type of war and the constant threat of nuclear war, the United States took it upon itself to try to prepare the citizenry and preserve the government's line of succession, should they be attacked. Since nuclear war hung over the country's head constantly, they began forming new government organizations to prepare the country for attack, such as the Federal Civil Defense Administration, the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization, and the Emergency Alert System. After the Department of Defense pushed a pamphlet titled Fallout Protection, What to Know and Do, the government ordered fallout shelters across the country to be built, including right here in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. During World War II, the Office of Civil Defense served as the first organization to take civilian defense seriously as it pertained to retaliatory military action. Created through an executive order by Franklin Roosevelt, the OCD would focus on the protection of civilians during the war. This led to the organization working to install plans for blackouts, fire protection, and even things like child care, housing, and transportation. Also created on the back of the OCD was the Civil Air Patrol, which was considered to be a civilian branch of the Air Force made up of cadets from the ages of 12 to 21. These cadets would be trained by older cadets in all things aerospace so that they could complete their missions when the time came. Congress officially mandated that the Civil Air Patrol have 5 missions. These missions were, number 1, to create an organization that encourages and helps American citizens to develop aviation and maintain air supremacy at home. Number 2, to provide aviation training to all cadets. Number 3, to encourage aviation in communities across the country. Number 4, to provide private citizens with the facilities and resources to aid in local and national emergencies. And number 5, to assist the Air Force in completing non-combat missions. The Civil Air Patrol would go on to complete numerous missions throughout the decades since its inception. From hurricanes to search and rescue, these private citizens put their lives on the line to protect other citizens from dangers in the homeland. After a handful of years of relative peacetime, Harry Truman formed the next civil protection agency, the Federal Civil Defense Administration. Created in 1950, the FCDA succeeded the OCD as the main arm of civil defense in this country. Once the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic weapon, the president saw fit to bring back a civil defense agency to protect the homeland. The FCDA was tasked with evacuation plans should a nuclear attack or any other conventional attack occur on American soil. Created in 1958, the OCDM, otherwise known as the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization, was the natural successor to the FCDA. The OCDM took a broader view of evacuation and civil defense plans to better prepare the United States for any such incursions. After a few years, the OCDM became the Office of Emergency Planning in 1961, and then changed names again in 1968 to the Office of Emergency Preparedness, where the organization would find a home until 1973 when it was abolished for good. With the creation of these national civil protection organizations, the government needed a way to share pertinent information in the face of a disaster, so people could evacuate or find shelter away from danger. Thus, a long line of emergency systems was created and evolved over the next 50 years. If an enemy were to attack the United States, regardless of its weapon of choice, the government would need a way to direct evacuees and share emergency information with the public promptly. This led to the creation of the Control of Electromagnetic Radiation, or CONELRAD, in 1951. CONELRAD is not an organization, but a way of communicating. The system would allow radio broadcasts with defense information, but would switch stations so that the potential Soviet attacks could never find the transmission stations. The method of communication involved a long chain of overlapping radio stations moving all across the country. The first transmission station would broadcast for 5 seconds, shut the station off for 5 seconds, transmit for another 5 seconds, and then send out a 15-second tone to alert stations down the line. This process would repeat as it hit each station, creating a domino effect that would send proper information across the country without any attackers being able to triangulate the location of these transmission stations. Unfortunately, as happens with technology, CONELRAD became obsolete within a decade. Due to the invention and successful test of the intercontinental ballistic missile, bomber attacks were less likely to occur, which led to the establishment of the emergency broadcast system in 1963. The emergency broadcast system was activated by the President of the United States. He would relay the information to his communications staff, who would then send the message down the line, ultimately reaching the numerous radio stations and television stations with a coded message meant to initiate the emergency broadcast system. Even though the system was never used for an attack, it successfully spread pertinent information about civil emergencies and hazardous weather conditions to the entire country. In 1997, the newest warning system, the Emergency Alert System, would be put into action. Also requiring the President to start the dissemination of information, this system would do away with the old code system in exchange for a digital code system. This allowed for fewer false alarms and improper interpretation of messages. Like the emergency broadcast system before it, the Emergency Alert System has never been used for an attack, but rather for weather alerts and other important civil matters. The Emergency Alert System is still active today, and you most certainly have heard its monthly test. In December of 1961, the Department of Defense released their Fallout Protection: What to Know and Do pamphlet that would go on to change the landscape of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park forever. This DoD pamphlet led to the government's creation of 400 radioactivity monitoring stations throughout the national parks. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park would receive one of these new stations along with 7 fallout shelters. These fallout shelters were peppered across the Smoky Mountains for federal agents, park officials, and the public to take refuge in the case of an attack on the country. A total of 7 shelters were built inside the park, and 2 were built outside the boundaries of the park, but not far away. The 7 fallout shelters were located at the park headquarters basement, the Sugarlands Visitor Center basement, the Oconaluftee Ranger Station basement, a tunnel on the Gatlinburg Pigeon Forge Spur, Calderwood, Cherokee Dams, and Gregory Cave. The majority of the fallout shelters could hold hundreds of people, but Gregory Cave could hold thousands of people. Each shelter was stocked with supplies. 2 weeks of food, including baby food, was given to each shelter. Enough water was stocked in each shelter for each person to have 7 gallons of water per day. There were even tons of copies of medical publications so that those that survived could learn basic medical procedures and techniques to take care of other survivors. In 1963, the National Park Service issues the Emergency Operator Handbook, followed by the Great Smoky Mountains National Park Supplemental 6-page assessment a year later. The effect of these documents on emergency procedures was massive. They implemented an entirely new system of the continuance of government should an attack occur. In the aftermath of an attack, the procedures followed specific instructions. First, every Great Smoky Mountains National Park employee had to register with the post office to begin the continuity of government procedures. There will have already been a payment system set up and funded for those still alive in the aftermath of destruction. I doubt the US dollar would have any buying power after such an attack, but maybe they thought even further ahead and funded the payroll with precious metals. Federal employees left over after an attack were to immediately disperse to all federally historical landmarks in the national park: cabins, lookout towers, Even Cades Cove would have been on the list despite not being an official historical landmark at that time. The next duties of the national park employees were to locate and cut off contaminated water supplies. Then they focused on checking radiation levels of both people and goods that were left over. Needless to say, the plans were extensive, even if they were only focused on the continuity of government. The supplemental document even expressed its line of succession should park officials remain the only citizens alive. The official Great Smoky Mountains National Park line of succession looked like this. First was the superintendent, then the assistant superintendent, then the chief ranger, then the park engineer, then any administrative officers, and then the chief park naturalist. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park was chosen as a prime location for the continuance of government in the event of a nuclear attack because of its location and the resources it could provide to an upstart government. These fallout shelters and monitoring stations would allow the area to theoretically protect itself from any further damage after the attack. To say that this was planned thoroughly would have been an understatement. The Cold War had become such an influential event to pop culture and governmental decisions that the potentialities were beyond dangerous. They were world-ending. Our country needed to do whatever it could to ensure the survival of its citizens and itself as an entity in case of such an emergency. This is just one instance of forethought that was put to action rather than simply fear-mongering the public into an action of war. We need to take note of these positives, and even though the attack never came, the foresight is still justified.